One of the biggest takeaways of the Iran war is how a much smaller enemy can deny a superpower a quick win. This week, Tehran almost hit the US's Diego Garcia base, long thought to be at a safe depth at 4,000 kilometers away, despite near destruction of Iran's missile capability. What are the lessons for any high-stakes Taiwan war? From coalition and allied exposure to the weaponization of energy, water and economics, the primacy of the narrative battle, understanding war's levers of escalation, to how the control of choke points and sea lanes is the new power in our times. In one of the clearest lessons that's emerged so far, Taiwan President Lai Ching-te has announced the restarting of 2 nuclear plants, prioritizing energy security over the country's non-nuclear policy. And yet, with a US threat and intelligence report saying China is not planning a 2027 invasion of Taiwan, should this mean the country takes its eye off the ball? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ika Vat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by, from Sydney, John Lee, Hudson Institute Senior Fellow, University of Sydney US Studies Centre Senior Fellow, and in the studio, Tristan Tang, Taiwan Defence Studies Initiative co-founder and National Bureau of Asian Research non-resident fellow. Tristan, warm welcome back to Taiwan Talks. And from Sydney, John, very warm welcome back. Just in from Reuters, we're hearing that they've spoken to 2 sources and apparently thousands of US troops. This is from a particular division. Let me get the name. It's the US Army's elite 82nd Airborne Division will be sent to the Middle East. You know, what's your immediate reaction to that, and in particular in relation to any Taiwan war?
So I think there's 2 possible uses of these troops. The first would be to launch an operation in a future time to physically extract any nuclear material, which they believe is still in Iran and is capable of being used for a nuclear weapon. The second possible use I can think about is that in the immediate term, Trump has to stabilize the Straits of Hormuz. Ships have to start passing because the impact on a global economy is too great. So a potential use of these troops is to deploy them to escort or stabilize the areas around the Straits of Hormuz to allow some level of normal shipping to occur. And finally, I think you would have to say President Trump, based on recent record, that he likes keeping options on the table, even if they're not real, to enhance his negotiation position vis-a-vis Tehran. So I think they're the possible uses of these troops.
Okay, so let's now go to Tristan and ask, so are there any implications there for a Taiwan war?
I would say the most important thing is that although President Trump has said many times that he will not get the US to involve another protracted war, and a lot of people think he will not deploy ground troops to the ground. But I would say signaling that possibly a paratroopers would go into Iran, which would serve as a what international relations theory called costly signal, to let the Iranian and to let the world know that President Trump is willing to take a possibly costly operation to show the resolve that Iran must restore the operation or the maritime route of the Strait of Hormuz. And in terms of Taiwan, I would say President Trump could still trying to weigh in during the Taiwan war if that really happened, just like what he's mentioned that he would not send the ground troops to Iran, but he's still preparing to.
Okay, so you're saying that Xi Jinping mustn't rule anything out when it comes to Donald Trump. Okay, back to John in Sydney. Now, observers have said that parallels can't be made between the Iran war and any Taiwan war because China is simply so much more powerful than Iran relative to the US. What's your view of this kind of perspective?
Well, let me slightly twist your question around and answer the question. If I were in Beijing, if I were Xi Jinping, what are the couple of lessons I would learn from this? The first lesson I would learn is that without troops on the ground, it's very difficult to affect regime change. And this would not be this would be a lesson which Xi Jinping would not like to have learnt, but I think it's something that he will consider given what we've seen. The second lesson which I think the Chinese will have learnt from what we've seen is that when a larger power, whether in this case, it's the United States, but in hypothetical, it's China attacks a smaller power. If you do not achieve a quick and decisive victory, which is what Trump expected when he first attacked Iran. So if China attacks Taiwan and does not achieve a quick and relatively clean victory, the disruption and the cost to China and to the global economy grows. And the longer you are trapped in a war like this, the more pressure there will be from outside for you to come to a negotiated settlement, which may not be on terms that you want. So for me, they're the two lessons that the Chinese should learn. And obviously the Taiwanese should absorb that and make it as hard as possible for China to really pull that trigger.
And Tristan, just wanting to cover off the fact that, if we compare the Iran war with the Ukraine war, the sea aspect of the war too, that this is, that there are lessons that can be learned and applied for Taiwan.
Definitely, and I would say most important thing is the maritime sea route, as we have keep on discussing about the Strait of Hormuz being blocked by Iranian, and this is a very vital lesson for Taiwan, for Ukraine, and the war that even though Iranian is not really have a capable navy and air force to control the sea, but they can still have enough missiles and UAVs to conduct such a denial operation to forbid or to risk any sea route or any transportation from Strait of Hormuz.
And in terms of that sort of asymmetric lesson, John, just bringing you back in from Sydney, what is the core lesson in terms of asymmetric warfare for Taiwan?
If you're a smaller power and your purpose is to disrupt, you don't necessarily have to control the maritime space, the airspace, or the land space. You really just have to introduce enough risk for other entities for them to make life uncomfortable for them. So I think that's a lesson that the Taiwanese should absorb, and they should think of ways to disrupt the Chinese in asymmetrical ways should there be a war in the Taiwan Straits.
Okay, Tristan, so just very quickly on this intelligence report from the US intelligence community saying that China is not planning to invade in 2027, there's no timeline. Taiwan's opposition has reported in international media to have replied to the Americans, well then why should we need to approve the defense budget? What's your view about this situation?
In February 2023, when then CIA Director William Burns mentioned the so-called timeline 2027, what he's saying is the capability. He said, in terms of intelligence, he knows that Xi Jinping instruct the People's Liberation Army to be ready for a successful invasion by 2027. So what Taiwan right now is trying to do is to build up our military. So it doesn't matter whether the 2027 is real or the timeline is 2028. We need several years to build up a military in terms of buying new weapons from the United States. Even we buy those weapons in 2026, it would not be shipped out in 2027. It would probably take 3 to 5 years or even longer for the weapons to deliver.
More still urgency on that. Okay, now Donald Trump on March 23rd stepped back from his threat a day earlier to destroy Iran's power system if Tehran didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. Iran had responded to that threat, saying it would target all critical infrastructure in the region. Trump then said he had implemented a 5-day pause as negotiators on both sides were in talks and making good progress. The New York Times reported that the US had sent Iran a 15-point plan to end the war.
They're going to make a deal. They're going to make a deal. They did something yesterday that was amazing, actually. They gave us a present, and the present arrived today. And it was a very big present worth a tremendous amount of money. And I'm not going to tell you what that present is, but it was a very significant prize. And they gave it to us, and they said they were going to give it. So that meant one thing to me: we're dealing with the right people.
Iran's Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Khalibaf denied negotiations had taken place, but later Iran Military News reported that Iran's Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi is heading for talks with, quote, the Great Satan. So, John, what's your analysis of why Trump pulled back? And again, are there implications for any Taiwan war?
Donald Trump has offered a pause because he doesn't really want to target civilian infrastructure in Iran. I'm not saying he wouldn't in some circumstances, but if he does, that's a very clear escalation. It would invite Iranian retaliation against civilian infrastructure in other Gulf countries. And if that happens, you have a genuine Middle Eastern war, which is not what you have now, but you would have a genuine Middle Eastern war, and this would increase the necessity of actually having American troops on the ground, which is not what Trump wants.
Okay. Tristan, in any Taiwan war, how does China sort of exploit the US coalition or allies in order to gain advantage?
I would say most important thing, of course, is for U.S. to receive certain assistance from Japan or even Philippines. And because the operation, if the Taiwan War happened, it will be far, far away from the United States.
Does that make those countries vulnerable to attacks from China? I mean, can China do the same thing that Iran has done in the Gulf in terms of threatening in order to shape, the US's decisions?
Even though Taiwan is comparatively weaker to People's Liberation Army, but Taiwan still have a stronghold in terms of everywhere of Taiwan. So they would definitely need to use most of their ammunition on Taiwan rather than Japan or Philippines. And when we talked about Iran war right now, because Iran doesn't have the enemy or the ground force enemy on boots on the ground to defend with. And they don't have to deliver their forces to invade another country. So I would say most of the ammunition would not be used on other countries, but would focus on Taiwan in general.
Okay. John, how significant is the disagreement over US and Japanese views of Takaichi's comments made in November in the Diet relating to Taiwan? I mean, how important is it that allies are on the same page?
I wouldn't put too much store on the supposed disagreement between Trump and Takaichi. Takaichi really said what everyone already knew, which is that if there's an attack by China on Taiwan, this would be an existential threat to Japan, or at least a threat to Japan's core interests, and Japan would very likely be involved. I think most people know that. Certainly the Americans know that. I think the Chinese know that. The only reason why this became an issue was because of the timing of when she said it. And she said it at a time when Trump was trying to smooth the way for some trade talks with the Chinese.
But John, how about this threat and intelligence report for 2026? It's been released as something that's official, therefore it represents the US government's position. And it said there has been a significant change in Japan's position. It also used similar language to that of China. I mean, isn't that dangerous in terms of allies being on needing to be on the same page ahead of any war?
Having been in government myself, I would say this, that even though it may be a formal intelligence report, intelligence reports are often released by different entities and different bodies, and they often change their minds. Look, I don't think there are a few things that I don't think has really changed. China's still preparing for war. Xi Jinping is still determined to take Taiwan, preferably by negotiation, but if need be, by force. The United States, by its own national security strategy, says that deterring China is the number one military mission that it has. This is deterring China from launching an attack against Taiwan. So intelligence tends to change. It also tends to contradict itself depending on who's releasing the intelligence, even formal releases such as this. I don't actually think that the situation has changed at all.
Tristan, just moving to this idea of targeting civilian critical infrastructure. We often hear suggestions that Taiwan could target China's Three Gorges Dam. Now that's now going to be superseded by an even bigger dam, and that this would help Taiwan gain advantage in a war. In what sort of scenario would that benefit Taiwan?
I would say two things. Militarily, strike on the dam probably would not help Taiwan a lot. I would say the main purpose of striking the critical infrastructure in China would be punishment or deterrence to deter China from really invading Taiwan. But if they really do that, militarily, I don't think it would really impact the overall situation or outcome of the war. And another thing would be that if Taiwan want to strike a very distant infrastructure, it would take a lot of resources from Taiwan, including kill chain, or even need to receive some information from the United States, and that will be, I would say, very costly and not necessary. In terms of political, I would say if the war really began, I would say Taiwan's most important thing would be to gain more international support. And striking a critical infrastructure in mainland China, I don't imagine that would really help the political image of Taiwan during wartime.
Okay. John, one of the reasons analysts have said Trump could have stepped back from hitting critical infrastructure is that it is actually illegal under international law to deliberately strike civilian infrastructure in war. Is this a kind of legal and political minefield that creates divisions in the US and then, actually has an impact on the way that the US must prosecute the war?
About the legality of various actions. I think they're more concerned about the strategic effects or the strategic necessity of various actions. Look, the extraction of the Venezuelan president was most likely an illegal act. It's also difficult to find a reason in international law for this current strike against the Iranians. But the strategic rationale for both those actions in Venezuela and in Iran are actually very strong. So I think this is a president, this is an administration that focuses more on strategic necessity rather than legalities of such actions.
I want to push back a bit on that, John. I mean, there are divisions in Congress. There are many saying that the goals of the war have not been clearly defined or explained. And there's also just very recently sort of the allegations of manipulation of the oil markets. And we can see very clearly that Iran, through Twitter platforms like that, is sort of whipping that up. So, is this not a strategy that can be used in war, where we do need to look at the political or the narrative battle as much as the military?
We do, but I would say this, and I refer to what you raised about the American Congress, particularly the Democratic Congress people who have argued that Trump's action is illegal. I'm willing to bet that if in a couple of weeks Trump gets a pretty good strategic result, the Democrats in Congress will not really be talking about the legality or illegality of the action. But if this action drags on for weeks and months and the economic disruption and oil price is severe, then yes, the accusation of illegality will be very effectively used against Trump and against Republicans, particularly leading up to the midterms. My summary of what I'm trying to say is it's not that people don't care about what is legal and what's not legal, but strategic necessity and strategic results tends to override what is legal or what is not legal in these situations.
And Tristan, switching to the Taiwan war, in terms of this sort of like legal and political minefield, especially in democracies, what should Taiwan expect that China will be preparing as part of its warfare?
I think we have already witnessed that China has ramped up its foreign operation to characterize Taiwan as a province of China, of course, for many decades, but recently it seems they keep on putting pressure on other nations or even international organizations. Right now, what Taiwan can do, of course, is through our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to communicate with our foreign counterparts to stress that Taiwan is a free country and Taiwan has a lot to contribute in the world. But in terms of if the war happened, what Taiwan could do, as I just mentioned, that we can only try our best to preserve our political image and let the world know that Taiwan is only defending itself and that China is the invasion one.
So this is an Iran AI video from April 2025 showing an Iranian strike on Diego Garcia, the joint US-UK military base on Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean. Now, 11 months later, Iran has shocked the world by attempting the strike for real. One missile experienced in-flight failure and the other was intercepted by a US Navy destroyer. Now, despite its failure, the attack itself changes the strategic consequences of this war. So, John, can you explain to us how they've changed?
When we think about wars and when we plan for wars, we tend to think in very distinct, exclusive theatres. So, for example, a Chinese war against the Taiwanese, we tend to think of it as taking place on Taiwan Straits. A conflict over the South China Sea will be in very distinct parts of Southeast Asia. What we should learn from this incident is that's actually not how war works. So let's say there were a war over the Taiwan Straits. The Americans rely on assets based not just in Guam, but also in Okinawa, in Philippines, and even my country, Australia. And in such a war situation, it is not unthinkable that the Chinese would strike assets as far away as Australia.
Tristan, some people have said, or questioned, is Diego Garcia like Taiwan's Guam? We're just showing now a map which shows the distance. It's within the range of the Iranian strike, whereas, of course, we know that China has much longer range missiles. And as John had mentioned, even Australia, Darwin, which is where the military base, US military, uses that base, is just over 4,000 kilometers. Is it a very stark reminder of exactly how broad the battlefield will be?
Definitely. For example, we have Dongfeng 26, the missile from China, is dubbed as the Guam Express. So it means that they would definitely trying to use missiles or other elements to strike US bases around the Western Pacific. And if we take the February 2025 as an example, when the PLA naval fleet carry out a live fire drill or trying to carry out a live fire drill in southwestern Taiwan, they also sent a detachment to the sea between Australia and New Zealand to conduct their own exercise. So it means that if, in terms of operation, if China really want to launch attack on Taiwan, they will not just put their asset around Taiwan. They will also deploy their military elements around the Western Pacific to no matter deter or deny the United States intervention.
Okay, and John, what does that mean in terms of how Taiwan must change its planning?
The first thing Taiwan needs to do is make sure that it can survive an onslaught by the Chinese for more than a few weeks. Because if Taiwan can't survive an onslaught, then the Americans, the Japanese, or anyone else cannot assist the Taiwanese. Now, the Chinese have not really calculated for assets on its mainland to be attacked in such a war. And I'm not saying that Taiwanese are able to do that in any sustained way. But the Taiwanese should think about introducing some weapons in their arsenal that can hit significant mainland targets, because that just complicates the defense, but also strategic planning for the Chinese. And remember as well that the Chinese Communist Party, they have their own domestic pressures. Their elites in mainland China do not really want to see their lives greatly disrupted either over an action against the Taiwanese. So not just Taiwan, but Taiwan should think about having assets that can hit significant targets on the mainland, if indeed they're under an existential threat, which they would be if they were invaded by a PLA.
So you're saying greater counteroffensive, that Taiwan would have to hold out for longer, because you said that Taiwan needs to hold out until those US troops come in. But if those US troops are military is being attacked in Guam or Darwin, then Taiwan might need to hold out even longer.
Most of the Chinese firepower would be focused on Taiwan. So it's in Taiwan's interest to hold on as long as possible, but also to acquire some longer range offensive weapons that would cause the Chinese to consider whether it's really worth taking that military option.
And Tristan, very final question. Cluster bombs were used by Iran, as they have been used by Russia in the Ukraine war. What sort of damage does that pose to Taiwan if China was to use them?
So it would definitely cause a lot of problem in terms of Taiwan's military and infrastructure, because China did not sign the Convention of Cluster Munitions. So it probably implies that they have a lot of this kind of munitions. And of course, we know that Taiwan has a strong air defense system around Taiwan, but definitely it would not be sufficient to deny or to destroy every cluster munitions that China trying to drop on Taiwan. So what Taiwan could do would definitely just as President Lai Ching-te trying to do is the whole society defense resilience to ensure that even though probably infrastructure is being damaged or destroyed, but the daily life of Taiwanese people can carry on, so the will to fight will not be seriously decreased.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. Tristan Tang and John Lee from Sydney, thank you so much. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. See you next time.